Hi, everybody. Welcome to Popcorn Therapy, where the stories we love tell us something about who we are. You're listening to a special episode of Popcorn Therapy. Amanda Edmiston and I are doing a little bit of a special series on storytelling, folklore. The Popcorn Therapy is normally pop culture, but it's kind of like before pop culture, there was folklore and mythology, right? So it's sort of the roots of what this podcast is all about. And you may or may not have listened to our last episode together, in which I shared the story of Arvid with Amanda from my book, Witch, Healer, Priestess, Outcast. And today, Amanda is going to be sharing a story with me. So I'm really excited. I have no idea what the story is going to be. So I'm really looking forward to listening to it. I'd love, Amanda, for you to share a little bit about yourself and the book that you're going to be sharing from as well. So welcome.
Hi, Julie. Thank you so much for that introduction. And for all of you who didn't catch the last episode, Julie shared an amazing story, and I think it sits really well with the one that I'm going to tell you today. So do pop back and listen to that last episode if you didn't hear it the first time round. So my name's Amanda Edmiston, and I have been working as a professional storyteller and connecting that into my background, which is in herbal medicine, for over 16 years now. I'm based I've got 1 foot in Scotland and 1 foot just over the borders in the northeast of England. They're both places that kind of influence my stories hugely. I love looking at how the legends, fairy tales, folklore and mythology that surrounds us has the way that we work with plants embedded into it. So my take on stories as a herbalist is that quite often the role that the plants have within these incredible legends and fairy tales correlates with how we use plants in medicine, and quite often modern science has proven this, but these are things that we've known for hundreds, thousands of years. And the story I'm going to tell you shortly really is a real beginning story for me. This story for me is about one of my favourite plants, which is why I wanted to share it with Julie. And as she mentioned, we're both Verbena authors. This story kind of comes from my first book, The Time Traveller's Herbal. And the lovely editor I was working with just said to me, you don't need to write that whole... Hey, thank you. You don't need to write the whole story down because that story is riven into people's DNA. And those words really sort of sang to me. It's one that really seems to resonate with people. And it's a plant that we find everywhere in the world. There is hardly a country in the world where this particular plant doesn't grow. There is even a variety in Nepal, I think, that has a sting that is deadly. And if you haven't guessed already, the clue is there. The plant the story involves is the humble nettle. And I don't choose the nettle as my plant automatically. It is one I love, but it's not my which plant defines you plant. But it is a plant that other people associate with me really quickly because I work with it so often. Julie, I'm going to turn to you very quickly before I start on the story and say, what plant would you be?
Oh, wow. What a great question. I have a real relationship with strawberries now. I've had a lot of pregnancy losses. So there's a beautiful story in Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding, Sweetgrass, she is Potawatomi. I think I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's indigenous sort of border of Canada and the US. Mm-hmm. And it's a story about Sky Woman and how Sky Woman comes and sort of populates the earth with plants and so on. And she has a daughter, so she gives birth to her daughter. Her daughter becomes pregnant by the west wind, and then she dies in childbirth, and her body becomes more plants. So actually it's interesting because in our last episode, we were talking about the plants that grow from loss and how many stories there are in the world that have this relationship. But this one was about how strawberries are the heart berry, and from her heart grew the first fruits, the first strawberries, which is they're known as the mother of berries because they're the first berry to appear each year. And so for me, there was something really resonant about that, like the return of something, the gift after a loss, right? So obviously I won't get into my whole story there, but I have a big tattoo of a bunch of strawberries over my heart, right over my left shoulder. So I think that's a really important plant to me.
And I think your plant affinity does shift. You know, there's a sort of bit of folklore amongst herbalists that plants grow where they're needed. And part of what I think as a herbal storyteller, if you like, is that plants show up in stories when we need them as well. You know, plants literally spotted that we were storytelling animals and crept into our stories so that they could find a way to communicate with us, which is a little bit magical sounding maybe, but I think it's really true. I think that quite often plants that you need or have a really close affinity with will suddenly appear in a story, and in the same way that we do with creative visualization, where we know that science now backs up the potential for the body to be able to use creative visualization as a powerful technique that then causes a physical effect. If you hear about a plant and you hear about its ability to nurture you through a moment of trauma or grief, or through a physical situation where the elements in that plant will support your body and your mind and help take you through that, I think that plants can show up in stories that way, and that our affinity shifts as we need it. So I guess that's part of my underlying reason, if you like, for telling plant stories as a herbalist, and why that's where my work took me. But I love that. I think strawberries are beautiful. And the other reason I think I've heard it called mother of plants is because of that beautiful ability that strawberries have to put out runners. I mean, I've got wild strawberries that I brought from speaking of grief, my late mother-in-law's garden, where they run rampant, and I've put them in my garden here, and one or two tiny little specimens are already, even though, you know, the sun's only beginning to make its way into our life at the moment. Spring is still not entirely showing up, but, you know, those strawberries and their resilience, and they're literally putting out babies, you know. Yeah. So I love a strawberry. I think that's a beautiful plant to have. And I you know, for the book lovers here, I also think that Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass is like one of those books that everyone should have read if you're into plants and you're into stories and you're into engaging with the land and that connection for people. Robin's
It's a beautiful book. Yeah.
Stunning. Yeah, it's like everyone should have it. It's one of the books I constantly give to friends.
Same. It's a go-to gift for sure.
Yeah. And so I'm going to take that, and I'm going to say that this chapter of the book, The Time Traveler's Herbal, actually kind of connects to that in a way, because the chapter that I'm turning to, The Very Curious Herbal, is set in 1730, and it actually really leads us on a journey where we meet the very first woman to publish a herbal, Elizabeth Blackwell, who was from my hometown of Aberdeen, and who I had the most curious and incredible journey encountering. Must be 10 years ago, maybe more. I was doing a book week event in Glasgow, and I spotted that nearby the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, which lives up to its name. It's an incredible old building, and down in the cellar there is a museum with all kinds of, some fascinating, some grisly items that have been used historically by surgeons over the years. But upstairs is a beautiful old library. Now, I went there because they were having a public event sharing some of the historical herbals in the library. And I love a historical herbal. I mean, you know, beautiful pictures, the quality of the paper, just everything about it is stunning, you know. And some of them have got those oh so treasured handwritten notes in margins, and you know, there is a sort of, there's a weight and a resonance to them. And so I came across this one book, A Curious Herbal, 500 Cuts of Plants Used for Physic. And why it stood out was because it was written by a woman, or created by a woman. And then I discovered that she came from my hometown of Aberdeen. I discovered that it was the first herbal to be published by a woman, and that she had done so at a time when I say, they often say women didn't work, and that's a ridiculous statement, because clearly most of the population, female population, would have been working. But what that means, I think probably what is meant by that somewhat archaic, overarching statement is that women that history records, the middle class women, the daughters of the educated, middle class women and above in England would not have worked. Elizabeth Blackwell's also somewhat extraordinary because she elopes with her second cousin, who has said that he is a doctor and gone into practice in Aberdeen, and then is called out, basically. The pair eloped down to London. But in England at the time, there was something called coverture. Now, for those of you who aren't history buffs, coverture was a thing that happened in England where when you got married, your money, if you were a woman, became your husband's. We didn't have it in Scotland. We didn't go there. And so the Blackwells, even though they moved to England, Elizabeth kept her money. And this was somewhat extraordinary. Her father had been a wealthy merchant in Aberdeen. Aberdeen at the time had, well, just before Elizabeth left, was still burning witches or putting people to death for being accused of witchcraft. So that was the place she grew up in. But street sweeping had just been brought in. You know, that was a big new one at the time. People did, you know, sanitation was in a very different realm to where we are today. And street lighting was being brought in. Sailors were bringing in rum and sugar from the Caribbean. And, you know, there was horrendous trades, but this was also a very interesting time when things were shifting. She then moves to London. She sets her husband up in the printing business, and then he falls foul of the professional printers of London. He's not done an apprenticeship, he's not got any of the qualifications. Funnily enough, Alexander's called out again, and she finds herself in huge amounts of debt because he spent all her money. He goes to a debtor's jail, and she's left as a single mum with a young boy living in London, miles away from her parents. I mean, I'm going to be honest, I'd have upped and gone back home to Scotland at this point, but no. She finds herself walking around Chelsea Physic Garden. It's owned by the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, the people who turned to plants professionally at the time for medicine. But these were the people, the King's Apothecary. You know, these are powerful people who are changing the way we look at medicine. And the director at the time is a certain Sir Hans Sloane, who is not only the King's Apothecary, but he's also a plant collector. He's travelled across Central and Southern America. He's collected plants. He's worked on plantations. But despite having this connection to Britain's horrible colonial history, he is also quite interesting in that he listens to the people whose plants he is working with. So when he's travelling, his notes actually talk about how people in the Caribbean are using cacao. He talks about how they're using these medicines. It's his notes that say that the Spanish people, you eat tomatoes in the same way the British eat cucumbers in a salad. Interesting side note. In this era, the British don't really eat tomatoes. We're very, very wary of a tomato. In Scotland, they bought into the Northern European myth that witches use tomatoes to turn their enemies into werewolves. I love that bit of folklore. But Elizabeth is hearing some really interesting voices. She's not only talking to these incredible people in this beautiful garden, but she has access to the library, and she is commissioned basically to illustrate a herbal, and she draws from life in the garden, and she does so to support herself and her young child. She gets a seal of approval from Sir Hans and the head gardener, and she earns enough money to get her husband out of jail. Interesting note, for years, historical chroniclers, people who studied botanical history, claimed that she took the pictures that she'd drawn and took them into her husband in prison and got him to write the notes. Now, what we know about Alexander Blackwell and his credibility, and then there's Elizabeth, who is working with the King's Apothecary in a physic garden with a huge library to hand. And for some reason, possibly until I said it actually, about 8 or 9 years ago, everyone just went, Elizabeth took her beautifully drawn pictures and her husband wrote the notes. And I'm like, excuse me? Are we still saying that? Really? Like, you know, she's a learned woman. She's been educated. Her father's a wealthy merchant. He puts all his daughters through school. This is just utter rubbish that she got her husband in prison to write the book. So I think now we generally take on board that Elizabeth wrote the words. She gets Alexander out of debtor's jail. The book is published in its full works with 500 plants, from the humble dandelion and the nettle to the cacao, the tamarind, the turmeric, through to seaweed and trees. It's an incredible book. And when I saw it in the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, it really sang to me, because I had also started my storytelling journey in Chelsea Physic Garden as a single mum, bringing up my daughter, and she was from my hometown, and I just had one of those shudders go through my body. And
maybe she's an ancestor.
I'm like, well, I love the story so much. I started to write about each of the plants in her book, and during COVID, it was something that kind of kept me going with plant storytelling. I wasn't out performing. I wasn't running workshops in person. I didn't really have an access to it. I didn't know what to hang my work on, if you like. And I found this book, and I just thought, right, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through each plant, what the plant was used for in the early 18th century, and the medical facts about it, how that still works for us now, and how that resonates. And then I'm going to look at the fairy stories and the myths from around the world that connect to that plant and reveal a little bit more. And it was really the Very Curious Herbal Project, as I called it, that led to the Time Traveller's Herbal. So back to where I began, I guess. And so I'd like to share that with you today. I have beautiful nettle fabric samples and nettle paper that I work with in my live workshops. So you're kind of missing out on the tactile elements, if you like. But maybe you can imagine, nettle, I would add, is quite soft once it's been worked with. So the story starts in a castle, as so many stories do, with a queen who was sat in her tower spinning. Not rough, worn nettles worn by peasants, but finest silk, white strands of silk working them slowly and watching her 7 sons play in the gardens below. She loved her sons beyond all belief, but she wished so much for a daughter. And as she wished, and the cloth and the thread started to curl and coil in her hand, a single tear fell down her face, and she pricked her finger. The blood melded with the tear, and as the tear and blood found the thread, a raven flew past the open window. A rustle in the corner diverted her attention. A raven's wing, a drop of blood, a single tear, a white silk thread, a voice whispered. Behind her stood an old, old woman with long grey hair and a single feather at the tip of one strand that seemed to lift in the breeze. In 9 months your wish will come true, but your sons will pay the price. The Queen turned back to look at her boys playing in the garden and gasped. She turned to take her wish back, but the woman had gone. And once the blood has been spilt and a tear has fallen and the silk has wound and the raven's wing has passed, then there is no taking a spell back, or so the words of the story go. Sure enough, 9 months later, a daughter was born, and the Queen told her husband of the strange happenings in the tower, but there was nothing they could do about it. They watched and waited every day as year by year time passed, and the girl grew up to be beautiful, kind, and loved by her brothers, who seemed unscathed by the magic that had been woven. On the girl's 16th birthday, when she would become a young woman and the spell would pass, the boys were taken away and locked into the highest tower. A guard put on the door, secured with a key, a tower with only one small window, so high up that no man could reach it. And the Queen and her husband watched and waited and listened for the midnight bell to toll. The clock ticked so slowly, but finally midnight rang out on the clock, and they felt that surely their sons would now be saved, and they ran up to the tower and opened the door, and all that lay on the floor was a single white feather. And on the winds nearby that passed the tower, they could hear the low, slow beat of swans' wings. A year or so passed and no sign of the sons could be found anywhere. No one had seen them or heard of them. 7 princes, surely someone would know. But no one could find them. Eventually, the king and queen acquiesced to their daughters, begging and pleading, and said that she could add herself to the search party. They gave her a horse and told her to ride and find her brothers if that's what she wanted. So off she went. She travelled for a year and a day, some say, maybe more. But finally she found herself on the edge of a vast body of water, covered in mist. But there at the edge of the loch were 7 swans, and one, the smallest, had a gold chain, the very gold chain she'd given her youngest brother for his last birthday. Well, there could be no doubt in her mind she'd found her brothers, but now how was she to retrieve them from this enchantment? How was she to break the spell? She went looking for clues, and as she travelled round the edge of the loch, finally she found herself in front of a small, low, moss-covered cottage. It was surrounded by a bone fence, a path cracked with age, tormental and ground ivy incursioning into the path. She kind of could feel the ground beneath her feet, trying to rise up. The plants wind their way through her toes. She went to the door and bravely knocked, and it was answered by an old woman with long grey hair, a single swan's feather at the very tip. The girl begged her to tell her how she could break the enchantment her brothers had been put under. There must be something she could do, some way she could repay the old woman and break the spell and take her brothers back home. The old woman smiled and said there was just one thing she could do. She could go and gather nettles. Gather armfuls of nettles, take them down, wreck them in the loch, leave them to dry out in the sun, beat them, spin them, weave them, cut and sew, and make 7 shirts, one for each of her brothers. But the whole time she was working with the nettles, the whole time she was gathering, spinning, weaving, cutting and sewing, she must not make a sound. She must not whisper or sing, laugh or talk. She must tell no one of her plan. She must just make these shirts, put them over the necks of her brothers, and they would be restored. The girl didn't dare say another word. She went right to work. She gathered armfuls of nettles and did what the woman had said. She wrapped them down, she left them to dry. She beat the fibre, she spun, she wove, she cut and she sewed. And she started to make nettle shirts. Now, as with all fairy tales, something happened. Another young man came riding by, royally dressed. He was heir to the throne of a nearby palace. And, well, the story goes that he fell in love over the days with this mute young woman. Now, some stories say different things. This story is shared around the world in one form or another. And my favourite version tells that the reason the young man fell so profoundly in love with the nettle weaving girl was because he was deaf. He could not hear a thing, and the fact that she did not speak made no difference to him whatsoever. The pair could communicate through gesture, through pointing, through looking, through smell. He took her back to his castle and took her nettle shirts with him. She was given the finest room with the warmest fire, and everyone grew to love her. She was beautiful and kind and considerate and thoughtful. She made the young prince very happy. They spent hours gesticulating and showing each other pictures, pointing things out to one another and smiling. No one had ever seen him so happy. The whole palace seemed to have lit up with her presence, but only one person was not happy. There's always one. And this story is of an era, and that one person had to be his mother. Now, she was not a woman who was unaware of the dark arts, shall we say. She spent plenty of time picking out finger bones of tiny beings that had not yet met with baptism, burning them, casting them into the fire, gathering entrails and all sorts of hideous items, reading the most dark and dangerous books she could source, all for her own end. And when she saw this girl had stolen her son's heart, well, she went into a fury. She could not believe that her son was prepared to marry a girl he knew nothing of. Where was her heritage, her pedigree, her wealth? What did she know? Who were her parents? These things mattered to the Queen. Not the smiling and the love, but the solid facts of royal life seemed to be missing from this enchanted relationship. And she set about laying traps and trying to put temptation in the girl's way. She tried to find a way to discredit her in the eyes of her son. She set a guard to watch her day and night. Why was she weaving these nettle shirts? Why was someone who may be a princess, when her time came in her household, sullying her hands with this rough green plant? The days went by and the young woman did no wrong, but summer was coming to an end. The nettles were beginning to die back one by one. The first leaf of autumn fell, and there were hardly any nettles left. There was just one place left to find them, in the churchyard, where no one would gather any plants. No one would gather plants from around the graves of the dead, and yet it was the only place the girl could go. So she went out under cover of darkness, so no one might see her, and gathered nettles in the graveyard. She took them back and went to lay them down in the watery bath where she retted the plants. But the Queen's guards came and arrested her, because the only person the Queen claimed who would gather nettles in a churchyard at midnight must be a witch, and witches must be burnt. The girl took her shirts with her because nobody would touch a witch's work, and was dragged off to the dungeon before the fire was laid, and she would be burnt in the morning. There was just one shirt left to make, and her hands still worked. Her hands still worked on the final sleeve of the final shirt as the fire was lit. And although her beloved held out his arms and hoped and prayed a miracle might happen and that she might be saved, nothing seemed to be done. She kept sewing as the flames licked up her ankles, and as the final stitch went into place, the swans flew overhead, and she took the shirts and threw them over the swans' necks. They turned back into young men, and, well, if you could cure or heal, you were probably never tried as a witch. It was always people that made bad things happen that ended up accused, or were too noisy, or unpleasant neighbours. And despite the fact that it looked like a little bit of magic had just occurred, the brothers' safe return, was enough to mean that the girl was saved. Of course, it's a fairy story. And the young woman and the prince, well, eventually, after, he'd met her parents and all normal things had been seen and sorted, got married and lived happily ever after. The young princes were greeted with great joy by their parents, but there was still one person who wasn't happy, because now everyone knew that the old queen had been plotting and trying to accuse this one girl who'd just been trying to heal her brothers of witchcraft, and they found her dark books and the entrails in the cellars of the palace. And you all know what they did to witches in those days. I guess that's one of my favourite stories, and as I mentioned, sort of within the body of the story, it's one of the first stories I told in Chelsea Physic Garden, in the same place that Elizabeth Blackwell created the Curious Herbal. And it was a story that I grew up hearing, and I heard the Hans Christian Andersen version, but when I told it in Chelsea Physic Garden and in Glasgow, when I first embarked on my herbal storytelling journey, I discovered that it was told around the world. Wherever nettles grow, there is a kind of variant. It's not always exactly the same. There is a version where the birds are ravens. There's another one where they are cranes rather than swans. The plant is always nettles, and usually the girl is silent. And in later versions, where we sort of romanticize with the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, have this very romantic take where people do live happily ever after, and the pain is quite removed from the story. And there are more romantic versions where it's a lot more fluffy, for want of a better word. But I like that one, and I love that I discovered this version where the the young prince is deaf, and that this is not a massively unequal relationship, you know, because if she's mute and he's all singing, all dancing, we end up with a little bit of a situation that doesn't really resonate, you know.
It's a Little Mermaid moment.
You know? But yeah, so I guess we go back to Elizabeth Blackwell, and because this story is really of her era, and because I love the fact that this resilient woman who painted plants and published this book covers the humble nettle alongside the more incredible plants with a far more powerful medicinal effect, although I would argue nettles are pretty pushy, but that she covers those really simple plants that everyone has access to. Final note of her story: the next thing she knows is Alexander, the husband, go back to Elizabeth Blackwell, take your mind out of the story and back to history, gets a job as agricultural advisor to the King of Sweden. And the next thing we know, Elizabeth's off on a ship to sail to Sweden with her son, and she's going to meet Alexander, and then news comes through that he has been caught up in a Jacobite plot to overthrow the Swedish dynasty, and is executed, and his head is chopped off. And then history loses track of Elizabeth Blackwell. But we do have her beautiful book, A Curious Herbal. And so I guess that's the story I wanted to share with you today. It's my little take on folklore stories and real history, I guess. Or history as best we know it. I mean, there's always a bit of vagary with history.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, both levels of that story, the fairy story and the history, right? And then I guess another layer is how that Elizabeth Blackwell's story resonated so much with you, and your experience, sort of resonating with what she went through. I might share, from my witchy perspective, that idea of ancestors, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a relation, right? But you can have spiritual ancestors. You can have like almost archetypes of historical people who can like be a part of your inner council, So maybe she's one of your people, right? That help guide you in your storytelling and so on, right?
Yeah.
Check this out.
Wow.
So, as you were telling this story, so, I know sort of this story, but I don't really know it very well. Like, I know that it's a really popular story, in a lot of parts of the world. And what I'm showing you right now, I'll just explain for those of you that are not seeing the video. It made me think of this particular tarot card that was created by Yoshitani. This is the Tarot of the Divine, and you'd probably love this tarot deck because each of the cards refers to some folklore from around the world. I think it's a really cool deck. It's very beautiful, and I was thinking, hold on, I think this image is is in there, and I found it right away. So it's the Eight of Coins, which for me, the Eight of Coins or Pentacles is really like, it's actually quite a joy of work card. Like, it's all about kind of being in that energy of flow where you're just like, for me, when I'm writing, you lose track of time and you're just sort of in that zone where you're working. And the image shows a quite uncomfortable looking princess who's struggling with the nettles, right? With the prickles of the nettles, and you can see the swans flying up above her, referring to the story that in the booklet, they're calling Six Swans, and they call it a German fairy tale. And the way that you told that story is she has to keep her mouth shut while she's working with, when you're gathering nettles, they're quite prickly, I guess. And then, as you process them, they become very soft. I have a friend who's sort of a witchy herbalist sort of person, and she loves gathering nettles, and, she consumes them in like smoothies, or she'll make nettle cakes or things like that. It has a lot of like healthful properties. And she's gotten used to them enough that she doesn't have to, blanch them or anything before she puts them in the smoothie. She just pops them right in. Some people can do that.
Jump in here because there is a whole thing with herbalists where what you say, the old guys, you always used to say to you, you can pick a nettle, you have to just look to see which, because the hairs go upwards and it's the hairs that sting. And so if you press them down and making sure the hairs go up, they won't sting you. It's not, it's fallible. Roman soldiers used them to, on their joints, to the urtica in the sting will alleviate sore joints, but there needs to be a reason. As a plant, it's really high in vitamin B, in manganese, in potassium. It'll alleviate gout. It alleviates hay fever. But also, they're really adaptogenic. So they help your body cope with whatever you've got to go through. They're really resilient as a growing plant, and that resilience translates to the properties within the plant that you ingest when you take it. You only eat them in the spring, when traditionally in Scotland, anyway, we used to have them in soup rather than in a smoothie. And they don't sting you once they're cooked, but they do keep their minerals. But after the spring, when they start to get a little bit bigger, you wait for the end of summer when you take the seeds. Now, the seeds you shouldn't eat unless you're really fond of stimulants when they're too fresh. If you pick them off the plant, they're like caffeine for some people. Some people find them really super stimulating. If you leave them to dry out, that goes back a bit. But it's the perfect thing if you've got a really heavy-duty task on your hands. If you've got a load of shirts to make, nettle seeds are what you need, and some nettle tea. And, fabric, nettle fabric was very, very commonplace. And nettle paper was also really commonly used. Because, not everyone could afford vellum, but it's... Yeah, so I mean, your friend's quite right. Everyone should take nettles. I'm always like, here in Britain, where people are massively into, imported chia seed, which, heavens above, it comes from South America, is transported across the world, and then everyone claims it is a superfood. It's really good for you. I mean, you get the same effect from flax; it swells up. But why would you take a load of superfood from a supermarket and then go out to your garden and trim all the nettles back? You could just save yourself a load of money and go and use the nettle seed. And then,
Yeah, I like this, part of what you're speaking to is this idea of weeds, right? So many weeds are incredible medicines that have been used. And I like this story of, listening to how people are actually using these plants in the places that they come from, actually paying attention to how they're being used. There's so much wisdom in the indigenous knowing of the people who have been living with the plants and figuring out how to use them and so on. I often think of dandelions. I love dandelions. And they're everywhere. I mean, they're talk about resilient, right? And fertile. Do they ever know how to propagate, right? And nettle, I'm sure you know more about this, but dandelion, you can use it as a tea. It's great for detoxing. I actually ended up with some dandelion wine, from the market. We got a little taste of it and we're like, okay, this tastes really good. And also this is the season, to be drinking some dandelion wine soon. And I know you can make it yourself. It's a bit of a process that you have to kind of be committed to. It's these are the things that people are just pulling up from their gardens and throwing away. And it's no, this is actually, there's medicine here, or, pleasure, or there's, nourishment, in these weeds.
Yeah, totally. And I'm interested, do you have a culture of using nettles in Canada? I mean, do you have people talking about, are you familiar with other people? You said your lovely witchy herbal friends.
Yeah, they're Canadian. Yeah, I have a couple actually friends who are big fans of nettle and love the foraging, in the springtime, I guess, to get the nettles. My thing is they're garden witches and kitchen witches. And I feel like if you're sort of a garden herbal type of witch, you're a summer witch, spring, summer, harvest witch. For me, I'm a winter witch. I'm I'm an empathy witch. I'm inside my own mind and with my clients and in tarot and things like that. I'm an inside witch. So I really deeply appreciate those practices, but it's not the place that I it's not my natural talent to be in that to be in the garden and in the kitchen in the way that for
No,
some
and
it is.
I think that's interesting, and I think that's possibly why we're having interesting conversations about that, because I love how you are taking that sort of that winter season, if you like, from this. And I think stories are great actually, because stories are almost an autumn winter pastime, aren't they? As soon as we get
Yeah, absolutely.
dark and cold,
Yeah.
we take the stories in. So I guess I'm kind of interested to know your reflection on that story, and so I kind of feel like that there are different ways of looking at it. For me, I get
For
really
sure.
into herbs, and the fact that something so simple and everyday that we are all familiar with, is the enchantment, is the magic thing that affects it. But I love to hear from your point of view as someone who does take that empathetic internal
Right.
aspect and the psychology of it all. What you take from that story, if you don't immediately go into the plant like I do, what's that story saying to you from your perspective?
Yeah, so much. I mean, the first thing that really jumped out to me is the wish, right? The dangerous wish, wishing at a cost. And the idea of wishing for a child in particular, there are a lot of stories that where this comes up, right? And I actually wrote about, there's a little bit of a Baba Yaga, however you pronounce that, aspect here where you've got the witch in the woods, and the sort of deal that's been made, right, with this daughter. So in the story of Vasilisa the Brave, the way that I tell that story, the mother is praying and wishing, and she's leaving offerings to the Baba Yaga because she knows that this witch in the woods has power. And, she desperately wants a baby, like more than anything. And so she ends up making this deal with the Baba Yaga, that she will have this daughter, but in some way this daughter will belong to this witch in the woods, right? That becomes Vasilisa. She goes through her whole journey. She ends up with the witch in the woods who teaches her lessons and things like that. I have my own take on that story. But what I also find interesting about that is that it's in the story of the Virgin Mary and her conception. So in some of the source material about that, there's an apocryphal text all about like the prequel to Jesus's birth and so on, which is about Mary's birth and how she came to be and what her life was like. And in this story, there's actually a really beautiful moment of it where Mary's mother is praying for a child, and she has this really sweet like little poem that's in that apocryphal text, which I feel like so many women with infertility would really relate to. It's like, how come the sparrows can create children? Like, what's wrong with me? Like, how come, the apple tree can create more apples and I can't do it? Like, how am I so different from this world that is meant to sort of create, right? And then an angel comes to visit Mary's mother and says to her, your prayers are being answered. And so Mary, Jesus's mother, is also a divine conception, a divine birth. At the time that this happens, Mary's husband is actually away, and he's doing this kind of vision quest in the woods because he wants the same thing, but they're actually physically separated from each other. She's praying in the garden, actually, which you would find more interesting. And he's off doing his little vision quest in the woods, and then the angel tells her she's pregnant. He returns home and she says, I'm pregnant, with Mary. And then Mary grows up as this very special child. She's raised by the church. And in that story, it's like, she belongs in some way to God. Like they immediately promise to sort of gift that daughter to the church because God has answered their prayer. So there's a little bit of like a bargain, that has to go on. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that shows up here too. We have it as well in Rapunzel. There's that sort of the daughter who comes and then she's owned by the witch in a certain way. I imagine there must have been many times in history, and now as well, where people just so badly want a child. And now we have so many technologies that can help us with that. But even still, how many of us have sat there, like just praying to anyone who would listen, like, help me with this. Like, I will give anything, of myself. I will sacrifice myself, my family, whatever it is. And then, in this story, you have the you have the dangerous wish, right? It's like wishing too hard and you have to pay that cost.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. And I think it took me off on two tangents. One is that historically, that would have been far more likely if you think, pre-adoption agencies, but all those things. But also that wealthy women, certainly in Europe, paid wet nurses. So feeding the child, right, however you do that, is almost like a really important bond between parent and child. And it's kind of, if you never fed your own child, if someone else took over that whole role and that they were caring for them, it becomes a very strange phenomena of how this child, who this child like connects
Is attached to,
attached to. And also people would have made all kinds of bargains to get children, and really dangerous wishes. And with Baba Yaga, I love your pronunciation, by the way, and I can't do that. I feel like it's quite authentic. It's quite good. I feel like
that's the Ukrainian pronunciation, but I mean, we've talked about this. It's like regionally, you'll hear these things differently.
Yeah, we'll get onto another pronunciation rabbit hole. There are so many more stories to Baba Yaga, and incidentally, Hansel and Gretel shows up very much as a story of Baba Yaga. And so you've got this whole, and Rapunzel again, and you've suddenly got a whole series of stories about this witch who, I don't know, I never found her that malicious. I always, however badly, she gets labelled, I always found her really interesting and kind of enticing. I really liked her as a witch. Mm-hmm. I always thought she did Vasilisa a massive favour, and she was doing, okay, so she made her work. Tough. You had to learn some lessons, honey.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
awesome. I haven't got on to that one.
I have Baba Yaga, or Baba Yaga, however you want to pronounce it, in Maiden Warrior Mother Crone. And I totally agree. I see... there's this theme of Baba Yaga wanting to eat the children, right? And there are different ways of interpreting that. And one is people needing a scapegoat for why children would be taken by illness or plague at the time or whatever it was. And being able to say there's this witch in the forest was like a helpful way for people psychologically to deal with those losses.
Yeah.
Another way of looking at it is that she's another one of these goddesses, right? Who's like replanting the children, baking them into bread kind of thing. It's like a death rebirth sort of thing. This idea that they would take these babies unbaptized or whatever it is and kind of like bake them and let them return in that way. But I think the way that I like the concept of Vasilisa's a little too sweet. She needs some seasoning, right? And in that story, she has another motif we see in so many of these fairy stories is like, the impossible task and then having the supernatural help to complete the impossible task. We see that in Cinderella as well, which I feel like Vasilisa is maybe a root story to Cinderella. But it's this idea that like she needs to learn like you can look at it different ways. One way is in terms of work, but like the poppy seeds, one of her tasks is separating poppy seeds from dirt. And poppy seeds is opium, of course, right? It's a psychedelic medicine, I guess.
Is Demeter and Persephone, and
yes,
the gifting of poppies to cope with the grief.
Yes, and corn, the good corn from the bad. Apparently, corn, like fermented corn, was also used as a psychedelic as well. So it's like Vasilisa's kind of having these journeys. She's having these plant medicine journeys, which is making her wise, right? I think is kind of Baba Yaga's task. And so the way I read her is very much that she's like, you are, because of this bargain, like you belong to me in a certain way, but I'm going to help you become a woman. Like I'm going to help you become wise. I'm going to help you like to be able to be strong enough to fight against your abusers, right? Which is partly what's happening is her evil stepmother sends her to the witch in the forest hoping she'll be consumed. But what she does instead is learns the tools she needs to fight back against that abuse and get free is a different way of looking at it, right? So that's kind of how I read the story. And
you do get consumed by something, don't you? I mean, if you have a really harrowing or difficult learning journey, and sometimes the most profound learning journeys where you come out the other side a completely different person, although you might have been learning something incredibly beautiful and useful and interesting, there's sometimes like, it's literally like, you know, your soul, your essence has been put through the blender with your brain is mush with this stuff. You're going, how am I going to learn this? What's going to happen? And then afterwards you're like, okay, right, I'm probably a better person for that. You know,
Yeah.
I'm not wishing it on anybody, but okay, that was what I needed. That's worked. You know, and I think that, yeah, you're right. I think she really does go on one of those journeys. I quite like that. I also like that you like Baba Yaga. I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
you know, I think
She's an ally. Yeah,
one
for
of, one
sure.
of a number of witches that are massively hard done by. And until I
Yeah.
discovered that Hansel and Gretel, the witch in Hansel and Gretel was, you know, a Baba Yaga, I'm like, or was
Sure,
Baba
yeah.
Yaga, I'm like, I always felt really sorry for her as well. I mean, you've just
Mm.
had some kids come and eat your house.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, genuinely. Um,
Yeah, and from that scapegoat perspective too, right? Like you said, a lot of the time the witches that were accused were the ones who were noisy or annoying. And, you know, in some of the stories that I heard as well, they would often be widows,
yeah,
which on the one hand meant some of those widows had their own money and didn't
yeah.
have to participate in this patriarchal
Hmm.
you know, rule book that everyone had to follow. But the other side of it, of course, is in certain times, like those widows wouldn't have had money and needed help from the community, and there was no help to be given. And
Yeah,
so, you know, sacrificing these like quote unquote old witches was a way of like a much darker way of trying to protect the community and their food resources, because during plague times and so on, like things were really
yeah, sure, that's a
scarce,
very
right?
good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I mean, I will say one more thing about the dangerous wish and the infertility thing. I had mentioned that I had these pregnancy losses, and a little survivor's guilt came up for me in that moment. It's like, for me, with everything I've been through, I have had moments of feeling like, you know, I know how many stories there are out there. I know how hard people have had it. And I've come to the other side of my extremely challenging journey. I've had 5 losses, but I have 2 healthy children. So, you know, it's been a tough journey, but I have these incredible gifts on the other side. And sometimes there is this way of thinking about it where it's like, what was the bargain? You know, what was the cost of having these children? And sometimes I have this feeling of like, why did I get to the other side of this? Like, how come I'm allowed to have, you know, this happy ending in a way that not everybody gets to have it? And sometimes that comes up for me in kind of a complicated way. And so I feel like maybe the story is holding a little bit of that dangerous wish or that kind of like cost to pay, as another one of those ways of kind of like containing a psychological complication, like that psychological feeling of, how did I get to be so lucky? And that feeling of, you know, the way that you kind of describe the king and the queen sort of holding in fear, like not really knowing what the cost is going to be. Like everything's going fine. They're looking at their boys. They don't know when it's going to happen, right? It's that fear of the other shoe being about to drop. And I feel like that's something that's come up for me in different ways. Like when things work out for you, especially when they haven't in the past, sometimes you can be like, when am I going to lose all this again? You know, like when is this going to sort of go wrong for me? So I heard a little bit of that in the tale too, the way you told it.
Yeah, I think the way I tell it, it does contain a bit of that, and I really think, I guess, you know, we tapped on my talk about hidden herbals last time, and I think although nettle is a really benevolent herb, I think it doesn't really cause much harm. It is a real supporter during pregnancy, and I think that's kind of woven into that story too. In that, you know, if you suffer from iron deficient anemia, herbalists usually nettle is our go-to help with iron deficient anemia during pregnancy, or heavy blood loss afterwards, or, you know, rebuild strength afterwards. So there really is this strong like core of nettle throughout that story, because at each point of the story, whether it's a dangerous wish or that really potential for something that is very familiar probably to most women at some level, whether it's been, you know, you've had a lot, but I don't know many women who haven't been through 1 or 2 you know, pregnancy losses.
Right.
And I think actually it's one of the interesting things. We're talking about the things that we shouldn't talk about. Last time we picked up on that. pregnancy loss is another one that people don't talk about a lot, that I think we maybe should be more open about, because I think if you knew there's something, probably every other woman, if not 2/3 of women, will have been through at least one, then I feel that
It's way more common than most people
strengthening
know.
for quite a lot of people. Because in times past, certainly, you know, I was touching on the 18th century with that, or the early 18th century, you'd have probably had more pregnancy losses than, or early child losses than you would have strong and healthy children.
Right.
So there's that theme as well. And that's really discomforting to a lot of people these days, but it's possibly something that we need to bring back. Community empathy and emotional resilience, if we acknowledge these things, and then could be more supportive of each other because we're aware. I think awareness is quite often the key to being supportive human beings. You know, if you know that that's something women go through, then you can hold out your hand and say to your friend or neighbour or niece or something, shit, honey, I know this happened. And here's my toolkit. Here's my emotional toolkit. Right. Here are my fairy stories. Here are my herbs. This is what I've got. It might not solve everything, but here you go. You know?
Yeah, I mean, you know, for me, so much of the struggle with that was feeling like it was my fault, you know, or something wrong with me. And I feel like once you do have that awareness that like, wow, this happens to a lot of people. Like, it's not just like something that I did wrong or some dangerous wish I made or some cost I'm paying to the universe or God or whatever it is. Like, I'm not being punished for something. You know, this is truly something that a lot of people do go through.
Modern medicine, I mean, I remember going through something myself and thinking, and then reading the advice, and I'm like, oh, I've done half these things. You know, this is my fault. I've had a glass of wine. I've eaten some blue cheese. I've gone out dancing until 3 a.m. This would be my fault, and it's not. It's very unlikely to be, but there is that whole sort of, because you're silent and you kind of and sometimes that goes back to fairy stories being a safe place, or stories being a safe place to look at difficult situations. If you don't have that community around you to talk about it frankly, or to seek advice, or even a shoulder to cry on, you'd maybe have a story. And, I hope that's something that it's a small drop in the ocean, but it's something we're kind of attempting to do here by holding this space and talking about these stories in this context, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that strawberry story from Braiding Sweetgrass has been a part of my toolkit, I would say. Like, it's something that I sort of return to. And that's why I got these tattoos of the little baby strawberries, like all can count them, on near my heart, because that story has helped me to know that I'm not alone and feel like there's a meaning to those losses, and like to keep them with me. It's something about like that this story of loss is so old, and so known. There's something about that just, it does make me feel less alone in it. So I totally agree with, that idea that you can, and, for those of you listening, we talked about this in the last episode a little bit. This idea that like, we were talking about Bluebeard's Castle as a story of someone who's in an abusive relationship, and like being able to hear the story is sometimes the way that you can process that and then step back to yourself. Like, it's a safe place to kind of do some of that emotional processing, maybe even before you can admit to yourself what's going on, right? So yeah, I think these stories can be incredibly powerful in that way.
I think that's very true and very beautifully put. Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, and maybe I will add as well, like, for me, hearing the stories has been helpful, and writing the stories has been helpful for me. When I wrote Maiden, I kind of had this experience of like, I went through, some of the losses as I was writing this book. I was pregnant with my with my adorable 1-year-old Ozzy while I was writing this one. Like that, my experiences are so folded into the writing of it for me. And, I think I've kind of always been this way. I don't tend to share things that I'm still processing, just to be clear. If I'm sharing it, I'm very comfortable sharing it. I'm comfortable having questions about it. And this is something that I do want to support people in my practice. Like this is something that I'm happy to have people come to me with these kinds of stories and let me help them hold them because I've been through it. Not that I don't still have feelings about it or that I might, the grief lives on, but I'm comfortable with that grief. I hold it close to my heart, right? It's not something that I'm trying to reject.
I totally get that. I mean, I process through stories to the point that with Collected Curiosities, which, is out in June, follows on from the Time Traveler's Herbal. I have to acknowledge that I have my, as you know, one of my girls is 11, but the other one's older, and my my grandson was being babysat quite a lot of the time. And at the end of it, I got to the end, I'm like, oh my God, it's like a baby or a midwife or like someone's pregnant in every single chapter of this book. And I just put it, I thought, am I going to start like editing them a bit? Am I going to start reworking them? And I'm just like, no, I'm just going to say, thanks to my grandson.
Right.
Lay sleeping on my bed for most of the writing of this story. And, those babies here, deal with it. You'll be fine.
Yeah, and, the other thing is, like, a lot of these folk tales and fairy stories are the women's stories, right? They're the stories that were told around the fire by women, whereas the myths that I've worked with a little bit more, even though I've worked mostly with the goddess myths, those are more like the big overarching dominant cultural narratives, right? Yeah. And then these stories about pregnancy and loss and midwifery and medicine and like the sort of folk medicine that, some of these ancient witches maybe were involved in, maybe not. But these are the stories that were told by kind of the people who were actually living the lives. It's actually a little bit like if the myths are major arcana in the story, the folk tales are the minor arcana, right? It's like there's the big archetypes and then there's the actual stuff of day-to-day life that we need to deal with too. Yeah, the real people stuff, exactly.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, actually. But so stories, they're there to hold you and protect you and to work through stuff. Well, that solved the world's problems. Everyone find the right story and then like.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that story with me, Amanda. It was such a pleasure to hear it out loud, right? To hear the cadence of your voice and, how you're pulling in the pieces of it. Obviously this is something that you'll perform, right? It's not just something that's written. Well, what a pleasure, right? And what a gift to share. So thank you so much for doing
you're very welcome. And I really want to do this again. So, if you think of, tell me another story. I want to hear another story. I love the story you told me last
I think
time
I want to tell you Jezebel, I think, which is a little bit longer. I'm sort of obsessed with that story. It's not as herbal oriented, though there are pieces that come up.
I'll find one. I'll find you a Jezebel herb.
Right.
Like,
yeah. All right, well, we'll be back and we'll tell more stories. Yeah, so stay tuned.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. All right, thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day, Amanda. Bye.
And you. Bye.